Beaver pelts powered a continental struggle that rewired alliances, economies, and borders in northeastern North America. Start with the animal that set events in motion, the North American beaver, prized for its dense underfur. Europeans craved fashionable felt hats, and beaver underfur produced superior felt that resisted rain and held shape for years. This demand created a relentless market that pulled indigenous nations and European empires into a tightening web of trade, competition, and militarized rivalry. The beaver became currency, status, and leverage, and its habitats turned into strategic terrain. Before Europeans arrived, indigenous nations built rich networks linking the Great Lakes, the St. Lawrence, and the Hudson valleys. Trade moved through kinship, diplomacy, and reciprocal gift-giving, spreading copper, shells, and food across vast distances. Firearms were unknown, but bows, clubs, and political negotiations maintained a balance among neighbors. The arrival of French, Dutch, and later English merchants attached new goods to old networks, transforming relationships and stakes almost overnight. By the early 1600s, the Dutch established Fort Orange on the Upper Hudson, trading directly with the Mohawk and other Haudenosaunee nations. Metal tools, cloth, and especially firearms flowed in exchange for pelts gathered by extended hunting parties. The French, centered on Quebec and Montreal, fostered partnerships with Algonquian-speaking groups and with the Huron-Wendat Confederacy, who sat astride major canoe routes between the Great Lakes and the St. Lawrence. Each European foothold mapped onto existing indigenous rivalries and created sharp incentives to redirect trade. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy, known as the Iroquois to Europeans, comprised 5 nations before the 18th century. Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, and Seneca leaders coordinated war, diplomacy, and adoption policies through a shared council. They confronted mounting pressures from epidemic diseases that killed many communities, and from beaver depletion near their homelands. To sustain population and influence, they pursued 2 linked strategies: acquiring captives for adoption and securing new hunting territories that could supply pelts. Access to firearms became decisive because guns reshaped the balance of intimidation and defense. Dutch traders exchanged muskets and powder more openly than the French, who often restricted arms to their indigenous partners. As the Haudenosaunee armed themselves through Dutch channels, their raids grew longer in range and more effective against foes who lacked comparable firepower. Warfare did not erase diplomacy, but it raised the costs of ignoring demands to reroute pelts toward the Hudson. The first major shock struck the Huron-Wendat homeland around the 1940s of the 17th century. Haudenosaunee forces targeted Huron villages, trade depots, and missionaries who connected them to French markets. After several campaigns, the Huron Confederacy collapsed as a regional broker, with survivors dispersing to French settlements, to other nations, or into Haudenosaunee communities through adoption. This collapse disrupted supply lines feeding the St. Lawrence and magnified the strategic importance of other Algonquian partners. Having broken a key rival, the Haudenosaunee pressed westward and northward into the Great Lakes Basin. They raided the Petun, the Neutral, and the Erie, extending pressure into Michigan and Ontario. Many communities fled to fortified villages near French outposts or sought refuge with the Anishinaabe around the upper Great Lakes. This movement of people altered political geography, while pelts followed new paths determined by security, kinship, and the promise of dependable trade goods. French authorities responded by building mission settlements and forts, and by dispatching coureurs de bois deep into the interior. Canoe brigades carried metal kettles, knives, beads, and limited numbers of firearms to remote partners, trying to keep pelts flowing to Montreal. Jesuit accounts recorded both the carnage of raids and the complexity of negotiations, where wampum belts, prisoner ransoms, and diplomatic feasts punctuated ceasefires. Trade and war interlaced constantly, because every treaty also redistributed access to guns, powder, and credit. Meanwhile, English expansion, after taking New Netherland from the Dutch, in the 1660s intensified competition along the Hudson and Mohawk corridors. Albany merchants inherited Dutch relationships and sought deeper penetration into the interior. They balanced promises of cheap goods against the need to avoid provoking catastrophic French retaliation. The Haudenosaunee leveraged this rivalry, threatening to shift allegiance unless prices and supplies improved, turning their central location into strategic bargaining power. Environmental depletion shaped decisions across the region as beaver populations declined near heavily trafficked routes. Hunters pushed farther into watersheds of the Ohio, the Illinois, and the upper Mississippi, encountering new nations with their own claims and alliances. The Anishinaabe and their allies, armed through French channels around the Great Lakes, organized counterpressure that slowly blunted Haudenosaunee reach. Skirmishes at places like Michilimackinac and Sault Ste. Marie demonstrated that the western interior would not be easily dominated. By the 1680s, violence remained frequent, but clear limits had emerged. The Haudenosaunee could devastate specific targets, yet holding distant territories against coordinated resistance proved costly. French leaders like Governor de Nonville pursued punitive expeditions, while Canadian militias and allied warriors struck Iroquois villages. Retaliatory cycles burned crops and emptied storehouses, threatening famine that even successful raiding could not offset. Both sides sought ways to stabilize trade without surrendering strategic advantage. A turning point arrived with the Great Peace of Montreal in 1690. Dozens of nations sent delegations, each bearing wampum and claims for vengeance or restitution. The treaty did not erase animosities, but it produced a workable framework to reduce raids and reopen trade corridors under mutually recognized protocols. The Haudenosaunee secured neutrality in many conflicts between France and England, preserving autonomy while keeping channels to Albany and Montreal open. This neutrality carried costs, because European imperial wars continued to wash over the region. During Queen Anne's War in the early 18th century, English and French governors lobbied furiously for Indigenous allies. Many Haudenosaunee leaders maintained balancing acts, refusing deep commitments while extracting gifts and concessions. The result was a cooler temperature of violence in the heartland, even as outlying regions still saw raids linked to imperial campaigns. The economic foundations of the conflict shifted as fashion changed and substitute sources appeared. European hat styles evolved, and competition from Russian and Scandinavian fur reduced reliance on North American beaver. At the same time, overhunting had thinned herds, and profits moved toward intermediaries with credit and shipping rather than hunters alone. This erosion of beaver-centered wealth lessened incentives for long-distance raiding, nudging politics toward treaties, land sales, and fort building. Indigenous agency remained central throughout, contrary to narratives that portray tribes as pawns. Nations evaluated prices, travel risks, and diplomatic promises, choosing partners according to local interests. Adoption of captives rebuilt populations and incorporated skills, while councils debated whether to escalate or restrain warfare. Leaders understood that guns were tools, not guarantees, and that food security and winter shelter could determine whether campaigns succeeded or settlements survived. The Beaver Wars left durable legacies that shaped later colonial struggles. The Haudenosaunee emerged with enhanced diplomatic leverage, and a reputation for hard fighting, but surrounded by rivals who remembered losses. French Canada preserved inner trade routes and alliances that would later contest British expansion into the Ohio Valley. The relocation and merging of communities created multicultural villages that adapted languages, rituals, and political practices to changing realities. Geography helped structure the conflict, because rivers were roads and portages were choke points. Control of the St. Lawrence, the Richelieu, the Mohawk, and the Niagara corridors allowed rapid movement of canoes and men. Forts and mission settlements guarded these arteries, but winter ice, spring floods, and summer droughts altered timing and risk each year. Leaders planned campaigns around seasons as carefully as around alliances, showing the interplay of environment and strategy. Material culture reveals the texture of the trade that underpinned war and peace. Iron axes, copper kettles, woolen cloth, glass beads, and powder kegs served as both practical tools and diplomatic gifts. Wampum belts documented agreements with ordered patterns that recorded obligations and past injuries. Credit systems tied hunters to specific merchants, who advanced goods in expectation of future pelts, binding households to economic cycles beyond their villages. If you want a concise causal chain, begin with European demand for felt hats. That demand produced fierce competition for beaver pelts, which empowered armed middlemen and squeezed suppliers. Firearms amplified disparities, letting some nations coerce routes while others regrouped under new alliances. Epidemics, environmental depletion, and imperial rivalries multiplied pressures, turning trade disputes into sustained warfare. By the mid-18th century, the center of gravity had shifted toward land and sovereignty rather than pelts alone. British victory in the 7 Years' War ended French rule in Canada, but Indigenous nations still held decisive power west of the Appalachians. The diplomatic skills honed during the Beaver Wars informed resistance and negotiation from Pontiac's uprising through the American Revolution. The story closed one chapter but opened another, in which beaver no longer anchored economies, yet its legacy shaped every treaty and frontier line.